to this day, for some 3,300 years. And they know how to count that day because they were given that instructions in the book of Exodus. Because the Passover was not just a coincidence. It wasn't just something that happened. It was ordained by God. Is when he asked them to offer a sacrificial lamb and paint the blood over the doorstep, because it was going to mark the 10th plague against Egypt, the death of the firstborn. And if they were in that house eating that Passover meal, that night death would pass over them, and they would be freed from Egyptian captivity and on their way to the promised land. So God asked them to keep that every year in memory. And it's not by coincidence that Jesus entered Jerusalem during the Passover week. It was orchestrated by God, by his will before the foundation of the world. And it's not by coincidence when they were selecting the sacrificial lamb that Jesus became God's death, his lamb, his only firstborn, his beloved son, who he offered as a sacrifice for us. It's not a coincidence that the day they slaughtered the lamb was the day that Jesus died on the cross. And he spent a day in the tomb, 2 days, and on the third day he rose on the first day of the week, Sunday. Now don't ask me why, because we're not even talking about why the pagan name Easter was attached to this Passover week and the resurrection day. Don't even ask how come an Easter bunny got attached to this, because it has nothing to do with this highly spiritual religious event. But we're so glad you're here. So glad you're all here. And it's amazing that God gave life to Jesus on this day, and it's a day that we have spring bringing back new life to a world that's been sleeping for so many months. Isn't it beautiful outside? And it's amazing how God is so good to each of us, and he blesses us. And we used to say that we were gone from 7 people here to 70. By looking at the crowd, we're going to have to start saying 80, but that doesn't rhyme. 7 to 70 sounds better. So 10 of you got to stay home, all right? No, God is so good to us, and we're just thrilled for that. We're going to talk about the morning of joy, because Jesus experienced and brought about a morning of joy for all of us. And of course, we're talking about the day of his resurrection. And it was the greatest, singlest day that eternity has ever seen. And perhaps it's only going to be superseded by the time Jesus comes back and we see him in the clouds and we go home to be with him. But we're going to see that there's 3 days that we're going to look at. First, it's going to be the dark day of despair, when Jesus actually dies on the cross. And then there's going to be this day of darkness, of silence, where we're going to find people on the Sabbath day. There's no message from God. There's no understanding of why this happened. There's just confusion and doubt and chaos. And those 2 days set up the third day. The third day, which is the morning of joy. And it's our resurrection day. And so we're going to look at each of these days in sequence, not just to study about the death and burial and the resurrection of Christ, but ask a simple question: is what am I going to do with Jesus in my life? Because that's going to be a central theme in all of this. And it's going to be a question that's actually asked by Pilate himself before Jesus is crucified. Let's do that by looking at the day of despair. And when we look before the cross, we see that there are people having all sorts of reactions and responses to Jesus and his death. And in the description of the crucifixion is very brief. It's not dramatic. It's not played out like in a novel or a movie scene. It just says they took Jesus. Therefore, he went out bearing his own cross. Couldn't carry it all the way, so they took Simon to finish the job. And they took to a place called the Skull, Golgotha. And it just simply says, there they crucified him. Now, we could spend an hour talking about the horrors of crucifixion, how it was reserved only for the worst of the worst but no one's ever killed God's son. Not just God's son, the creator. All things were made by him and made for him. And yet, his creation is now slaughtering him on the cross. And along with two other men on either side, and Jesus is in between, Pilate writes the words above the cross saying, "This is Jesus the Nazarene, the King of the Jews, your king." Now, earlier in the week, we got to go back just real quickly, because when Jesus was on trial, we read this in Matthew 27, the governor says to them, "Which of two do you want me to release for you?" Because they had a tradition. They release on this Sabbath week, this Passover week, one man. They said, "Barabbas or Jesus?" And they all yell out, "Barabbas." So Pilate said to him, "Well, if that's the case, then what shall I do with Jesus, who is called Christ?" And they all said in unison, more than once, "Crucify him." Now, these are Jesus' own people. Earlier in the week, they wanted to crown him king as he entered Jerusalem. They thought their Messiah had come, but now they're yelling, "Kill him." And so Pilate said, "What has he done?" And they kept shouting without an answer, "Just crucify him, crucify him." But I want you to notice just one question here that Pilate asked, which really, again, is our theme of this lesson, if we're going to have a morning of joy ourselves. And it's the question is, what am I going to do with Jesus? That's what Pilate asked. Because he realized he was innocent. His own wife said, "Don't have anything to do with this guy." And he wanted to wash his hands with him. Pilate wanted to stay neutral. But yet he said, "I got to do something. So what do you want me to do with Jesus?" And folks, this is still a relevant question today. What am I going to do with Jesus? I can't just dismiss him as a non-historical figure because the evidence is overwhelming he lived. I can't just say that he's just a good prophet or a good teacher, religious person, because he doesn't allow for that choice, because he claimed to be divine. And he claimed to be your king. And he died for that claim. So that's not a possible solution, just say, well, he was just a good teacher. So it's still relevant, and I have to ask, and it's really a personal question. We all have to answer ourselves. What am I going to do with Jesus in my life? And we're going to discuss what some people did in their day, and we'll find that we're going to be one of those people, one or the other. So when we look at what they did actually do, we find in Matthew account that some just came to spectate. It says that there's a great crowd that stood at a distance just to observe. That word observe, it means to we get spectate or to watch. It's where we get the English word theater. They're watching just something just to see what comes out, how it turns out. They're not really interested in the man. They're just interested in the event. Some people just want to spectate Jesus. They're religious observers. What's sad is the religious people of the day, the leaders, the Pharisees and the scribes, they came and it says they sneered at him. They're making fun of him, looking down at him, saying, "Some king you are," looking up on him as a cross. The soldiers, they just mocked him. He saved others. Well, let him prove that he is the Christ. Let him come down from that cross and save himself. And then others, they wept. Because they got who Jesus was. But they didn't know how to deal with this. Because they thought indeed he was the Messiah. They saw the miracles. They saw one was, the blind were healed and the lepers were cured. And they thought he was the Christ, and to see him now dying this horrible death, they just weep. It's an emotional response, not to the event, but to the person. We see, though, others just beat their breasts when they left. Luke account says that. They just beat their breasts when they're leaving. And that's just a sign of emotional tension and terror. There's like, what has just happened? What has just transpired? Others, when it comes to the question, what are you going to do with Jesus? They ran. That was his 11 disciples. Judas had killed himself at this time. His chosen ones, they ran. And then some denied him. Peter 3 times, remember that. After vowing that I'll even die with you. But it came to, when he was put to the test, he denied him 3 times. And we're going to find him that they hide themselves in a locked room because they're fearful that they're going to be next. And that's why it says in John chapter 20, the doors were shut for fear. They didn't want to be seen next to Jesus lest they suffer the same fate. So when we look back at how people reacted to Jesus and we ask the question, what are you going to do with Jesus? We see all these different summaries. One concluded, though, and I have to leave this section with this. And it was the centurion who's looking at all these events, and he comes to a conclusion. He said, this certainly was the Son of God. So the crowd rejected him. The rulers opposed him. Pilate tried to stay neutral, just didn't want to deal with the issue. The disciples were in fear. The women loved him and yet didn't understand. The thief, though, isn't it interesting? He trusted him. Right on the cross and made the most amazing request. Remember me when you come in your kingdom. Jesus said, I will. Today you'll be with me in paradise. The centurion again recognized he was truly the Son of God. And even Joseph of Arimathea recognized there's something special about this man and buried him in his own tomb. This was the day of despair. To the world, it looked like defeat and failure. It looked like the end of this movement called Christianity. To the disciples, their king was gone. He was dead. Their hope was crushed. Their future's now uncertain. But we know, living past this event, that it was all part of a purpose plan. And God was certainly in charge. But that led to the day of silence, this dark day. And when I say it, this is the Sabbath day when they couldn't work. They're supposed to just rest, and they had to observe it. But we find the disciples, first of all, what are they doing? They're hiding in their locked room. And it says that, we give that account in John chapter 20, that the doors were shut, and again, because of fears of the Jews. And when you look at them, they're thinking, we're going to be next. But there's probably more than any confusion. Like, what just happened? What just happened? You have to understand, they have sacrificed everything for Jesus to follow him. They left their families. They left their business. Many of them were ostracized and cut off from their families because of their faith, not following this man named Jesus. They put all their hope on Jesus. They saw the miracles, and they're probably confused, like, hey, we saw him calm the sea. And Peter said, yeah, I walked on the water. How could he die on a cross? Can you imagine their confusion? But there's no answers to their questions. There's just silence. And that kind of trauma is kind of the worst of kind, because after the shock wears off, like, for example, when a loved one dies, we're in shock and we just kind of go through the motions. But then when everyone leaves after the funeral service and we're left by ourselves, that's when the despair sets in, isn't it? Because we're left to our own thoughts and just like, what just happened? And that anxiety can lead to severe depression. And they're just regretting, perhaps maybe we failed. Why did we even follow him in the first place? Because all hope is gone. Then we now look at the women. They're actually waiting. What's interesting, they returned to prepare the spices, perfumes, because they didn't have time to prepare the body totally for burial. And because it was late at night when they did bury him, so they planned to come on the next day after the Sabbath to finish the job, because they saw that Jesus was worthy of a proper burial, because they loved him. So they returned, prepared the spices and perfumes, and on the Sabbath day they rested according to the commandment. There's just silence. They're not doing anything. And I imagine they're conflicted just as the rest. Then we find the religious leaders. They're still busy too. They're plotting. Because they go to the Roman officials and say, this guy has said that he's going to rise again from the dead. And that's amazing. The disciples didn't understand it, but his enemies did. So they pleaded with it, give orders for the grave to be made secure until the third day. Otherwise, the disciples may come and steal him away and say to the people, he's risen from the dead. See, they're still plotting, and they're trying to keep Jesus in the grave. And they have a squadron of men, 4 men, did 4 shifts, so there'd be 16 altogether, and they have 4-hour shifts, and the grave is sealed, and if they fell asleep on their watch, they would lose their lives. And there's no way these fearful disciples who are hiding in a locked room are going to muster the courage to overpower Roman soldiers to steal a body. But we look at it. How do people respond? And what do they do with Jesus? Some live in fear. They don't know what to do with Jesus. They know he's real, but they still want to live their own lives. They know he's coming to give, and we're all going to give an account to him on that great judgment day. But they're still living in the dark day of silence. The women show devotion, though, don't they? It's interesting, throughout the history, some of the strongest spiritual people are the women of a church. And it's always been that way. And they're devoted. They're looking just for the opportunity to finish the job in which they started. And then we have resistance that continues on. There's always going to be resistance in the world. In fact, that's the majority of this world in which we live. They're plotting to overthrow and resist Jesus Christ and his followers. And we're going to find ourselves as in one of these groups, I would suggest. Because Saturday teaches a truth that many people live in. That they live in fear, or they live in devotion, or they're resisting altogether. And if things aren't going well in your life, I suggest that you're still probably trapped in the day of darkness. Friday was a day of suffering. Saturday, yes, is a day of silence, because they just have no answers to any of their questions. But that leads us to Sunday, the greatest morning in history. The psalmist wrote it this way, probably prophetically. Weeping may last for the night, but a shout of joy comes in the morning. Sometimes God is doing his greatest work when he looks like he's doing nothing. And he's preparing for his greatest example of his glory and his love when it seems to be the darkest hour of our lives. And Sunday is that day. It's the resurrection of the fulfillment of all of his promise. And again, the greatest morning in history. So let's look at the morning of joy. We find in John chapter 20 that it was still dark. It's the first day of the week. And Mary Magdalene comes to the early to the tomb, and it's still dark. I had to go and ask, what is sunrise in Israel? And it was at 6:20. So if it's still dark and it's just starting to rise, the sun, she's there at what? 6 o'clock, 5:30. That's devotion. And she comes there, and then we read the account of what takes place, that she was standing outside the tomb weeping. And as she wept, she stopped and looked in, because the tomb was open. There saw these angels when she looks inside, and they're sitting, one at the head of the resting place of Jesus and one at the feet where Jesus had been laying. And she witnesses these angels, and I can't imagine what that was like, frightening but thrilling. I just might ask, for those of us that remember the Ark of the Covenant, do you ever remember a place where 2 angels sat at 2 ends of God's resting place? That's the mercy seat in the Ark of the Covenant. The 2 cherubim sitting over the place where the blood was sprinkled on and God met his people. That's what we see right here. And she's fearful, but she's weeping. And when she said this, like asked this people, where have you laid them? She's inquiring, where is Jesus? Where is his body? Because she wants to finish her job. Then we find she turns around, she sees Jesus standing there, but doesn't recognize him. I don't know why. And she did not know it was Jesus, thinking it was perhaps the gardener. And he said to her, woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking? He knows. He knows her heart. And he knows who she's looking for. I want you to realize who this woman was. Tradition says that she was a former prostitute. There's no basis for that in Scripture at all. But she was a woman that had multiple demons that Jesus cast out of her. He saved her life and gave her sanity. And she devoted her life to him from then on. So it's not surprising it's in the wee hours of the morning that she's coming to finish the job and anoint his body. So it's also not surprising she's desperate when she sees that the body's gone. Where is he? And she just wants to find her Lord. And that's why she's weeping. She's weeping over her missing Savior. And Jesus asks her, who are you looking for? Supposing him to be the gardener, she responds, sir, if you've carried him away, tell me where you've laid him, and I'll take him away. And that's when Jesus reveals himself. And I don't know how it happened, but he said, Mary. Maybe it's the way he said it. Maybe her eyes are open. Maybe she looked up at his face. But she turned and said to him, Rabboni, which means teacher. She's just thrilled. She sees Jesus. And Jesus said to her, stop clinging to him. So she doesn't see him. She's grabbing him. He says, stop clinging to me because I've not ascended to my Father, but I go to the brethren, my brethren, tell them what you've seen and tell them I'm sending God and I'm going to meet them. Why is she clinging to him? Because at first she didn't recognize him, but now knowing who he is, she said, I lost you once, but I'm not going to lose you again. Stay here. Don't leave. That's how Mary of Magdalene responded to Jesus. This is what she did with Jesus. And that's a life of devotion. And we go on that he appears then to the disciples. And they're afraid. There's no more discussion and arguing about who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom. Remember they talked about that? Even the mother of the sons of Zebedee, James and John, asked Jesus, could one of my sons sit on your right hand side and one on the left? It was all about position and power and influence. None of that talk anymore. They're just fearful for their lives. And it's at that time that, of course, the ladies go back and confess, or tell that we've seen him. They think it's nonsense. They don't believe it. And that's interesting. If this was a made-up story, and some people want to claim it's fictitious, they would not have used women as the first eyewitnesses to the resurrection of Jesus. Because in that day, in that culture, women were not allowed to testify in court legally, especially for a criminal trial, as a witness. They were not allowed to. So if you were going to fabricate a story, you wouldn't use people that were never allowed to be a witness. You would have some well-positioned men to be your first eyewitnesses. So you might ask, well, then why did the gospel accounts and why were there women be the first eyewitnesses? And the only answer is, because that's the way it happened. It really happened that way. Because it wasn't a fabricated story. It's just the chain of events. And so then Jesus, he goes to the 12. And on the evening, on the first day of the week, when the doors were shut, where the disciples were, the fear of the Jews, Jesus stood in the midst of them and said, peace be with you. What perfect words. Because they're afraid for their lives. They're full of anxiety. They're wondering, like, what did we do? And Peter's probably full of guilt because he knows he denied his Lord and left him in the lurch. And what does our loving Savior do? His first words is peace. They need to hear that. And I can't imagine their reaction when they see Jesus. And I said, how many questions they peppered him with. He said, well, slow down one at a time. Like why'd you do this? What happened? Why'd you allow it? And later we see in Luke's account in chapter 24, Jesus opened their minds to understand all the prophecies about him, how he had to die as a suffering servant so to secure our salvation, because the enemy wasn't Rome, it was Satan who held everyone captive in sin. He opened their minds, but at this moment, they're just full of questions. And then we see that there was one disciple that was not with him who was able to see the holes in his hands and the hole in his side where he was pierced. But Jesus showed it to these individuals right now. Why? Because they're going to be eyewitnesses to the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and they're going to give their life for Jesus. And they have to be convicted that he is alive again in the flesh. And I just want you to see that last line. These disciples, what did they do? They rejoiced. This is the joy of mourning. This is the joy that comes when you come out of darkness and you stop resisting, you stop opposing. You just cling to Jesus and you fall at his feet and say, I'm just going to serve you. I'm going to serve you as my Lord and King. And that's when we move out of darkness and we find really the joy of mourning. And life just changes. Yeah, we still have trials, we have problems, but we have a King that will deliver us from them and keep us safe and give us peace. Now, we all know about Thomas, and he's wrongly called Doubting Thomas. And I've talked about this before, but he's not doubting Thomas. He's doing just exactly what the disciples did, the other did. They wanted to see the holes in his hands, didn't they? And they said, we've seen the master. He said, I will not believe until I what? Touch the hole's hand and reach inside and feel the hole. And what Thomas is doing is being the eyewitness you and I cannot be. Because I'm a skeptic too. I want evidence. I don't want just emotionally believe something is true. So Thomas is demanding the evidence that I would demand if I was there. He is my eyewitness. Does that make sense? He says, I refuse to believe. Good for you, Thomas, because you're not going to be caught up in a lie. So Jesus appears again. Isn't that amazing? This is 8 days later, and the disciples are getting inside, and Thomas is with them. And Jesus came. The doors haven't been shut. I don't know how he does it. He just appears. That's got to be shocking. And what does he say? Peace be with you. Then he turns to who? Thomas. Did he know that discussion? Does he know the doubts that are in your heart right now? Yes. He said, reach here with your finger and see my hands. And reach here and put it in my side. And do not be unbelieving, but be believing. And here's how Thomas dealt with Jesus. Because remember, our theme is, what are you going to do with Jesus? And I don't know if he fell on his feet before him, but he said, my Lord and my God. You're my master. And you're God in the flesh. And whatever you want me to do, I'll do. That's how he dealt with Jesus in the morning of joy. So we have one more untimely person that got to see Jesus. He appeared to 500 at one time. He appeared to the disciples multiple times after this. But Paul, talking about the resurrection appearances in 1 Corinthians 15, he talks about that. He appeared to Cephas, that's Peter, then 12. Then he appeared to 500, who many are still alive. The reason he puts that is so you can go talk to him. In this day, did you see Jesus? Yeah. You really was him? Yeah. And so that's why this Christianity just blew up so fast, because you can't build a worldwide movement on a lie, on a stolen body. No, it was all based on eyewitness account and Jesus' real resurrection that caused this morning of joy, that caused Christianity to spread around the world instantly, even when the Jews tried to destroy it. You can't build a movement like that on a lie. So last of all, he appeared to James, then to all the apostles when he ascended. But then notice in verse 8, he says, and last of all, I guess that Paul was the last one to get see Jesus. And we know that is when he was going to Damascus in Acts chapter 9, right? And he was on a mission to kill Christians. He'd run them out of Jerusalem. Now he's chasing them to foreign towns because he was zealous for God, but totally ignorant of God's will. But he was zealous. There's no one like Paul. And he said, last of all, as one untimely born, he appeared to me. It broke Paul. He's blinded because he was really blinded spiritually. Now he's blinded physically. He said, Lord, what shall I do? So go to Damascus and there will be told what you got to do. So he said, because of that, I'm least of all the apostles. Why? Because I'm not fit to be called an apostle. Why? Because I persecuted the church of God. He had his days of darkness, but this is his morning of glory and joy. When he saw Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, and it changed his life instantly. And he became the greatest gospel evangelist that the New Testament sees. So this is our decisive moment as we bring this lesson to a close. Because it's a turning point, the resurrection. The cross had crushed them. The tomb had just confused them. But the risen Jesus restored them. And they were better than ever was. And in many ways we can see the cross was the night and the tomb was actually the silence. But the resurrection day was not just the physical morning of the day, but it is our morning too. Because when we're baptized into Christ, we're raised with Christ to walk in a newness of life. And so it's the promise of every believer's morning. It's the resurrection. It's not just a time, an event in time, but it's about a person. And we can connect with that person, and his morning can become our morning if we just respond to Jesus accordingly. It's a spiritual morning that starts now, that we find forgiveness that we've always sought for. We find new life. And it's our future morning because we have a resurrection of the body that is promised to each of us that we're going to talk about, Lord willing, next Sunday night. And we're going to have eternal joy as we rest with our Father in heaven. And the reason Jesus rose is because no night is permanent for those that respond to Jesus appropriately. So every person is in one of two places. And I guess the question I'll leave with you, what am I going to do with Jesus? It's a question we all have to answer for ourselves. And now you can just say, well, I just, give mental sin, I believe in Jesus. But if you still live like the world, you're crucifying Christ all over again to yourself. You say, well, I'm a disciple and he knows my heart that I love him, but you compromise his word or just don't follow his word, you're mocking him. Because he said he has the treasure of all wisdom and knowledge, and his will is God's will. And when you say his will is irrelevant today and I don't need to follow it, you're mocking him. You don't know what you're talking about, Jesus. There's no middle ground. Either we spit on him and crucify him again, or we bow the knee and say, my Lord and my God. Every person is in one of two places. Some are still in the light, and some are now living in the morning of joy. And the decision is yours. Will your morning be a morning of joy as we sing this song before us? And it's called The Morning of Joy. Let us stand and sing together.
people who are coming to God. And when